I have the honor. Our speaker, by the way, today is Ambassador Theodore Britton. He is a Montfort Point Marine and World War II veteran and Korea veteran. I have the honor of presenting to our chapter his challenge coin. He's also a Congressional Gold Medal wearer. His challenge coin to the AVVBA, the Honorable Theodore Roosevelt Britton, Jr., Ambassador for Peace, Ambassador of the United States of America, Montfort Point, United States Marine. On his coin, Marine Corps emblem, the Mother Teresa medal, gold medal from the nation of Albania, and the Department of Defense. No, it's the ambassadorial crest. I'm learning. But in any event,
thank you.
I want to present this on behalf of our speaker to our chapter or our organization, the AVVBA.
On behalf of this whole organization, it's a wonderful gift. Thank you so much.
I had the tremendous blessing about 3 years ago, actually. By the way, I dare say that there may be some in here today who've never even heard the term Montfort Point Marine. After the Revolutionary War, African Americans, coloreds, if you will, were not allowed into the Marine Corps until about 1942. And when they were accepted in the Marine Corps, they were assigned to a base that really didn't exist. They had to kind of chop it out of the wilderness themselves and build a segregated base on which they train. Our speaker is a Montfort Point Marine. But I had the great pleasure about 3 years ago, and then I'll get out of his way, of sitting at a Marine Corps birthday ball, and the speaker came in, and this guy just blew me away. Never heard of him before, honestly, but I wanted to know more about him. Turns out he was just such an engaging speaker. My wife and I were just blown away. And so I learned later that Pete Mecca, our member, Pete Mecca, literally had written a piece on him maybe back 2011 for the Rockdale paper out there that gave a lot of his background. So he's getting out of the Marine Corps in 1946 when I'm being born. He's recalled, reactivated for Korea in 1950. He eventually gets out, not able to get his commission. It's a little difficult back then for people of his hue to get a commission. However, he got out, went to college, ended up doing an extensive and notable career in finance and banking. Later on, went into the government, housing and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and under President Gerald Ford was appointed ambassador to Barbados and Grenada, and then special representative to a number of other smaller countries that actually did not have an embassy. So his story goes on. He can talk about it much better than I can. I just want to say it's just an honor. One last thing, I know personally, two World War II veterans. We have one World War II veteran left in my church. I was telling him a few weeks ago about Ambassador Britton, and I said, I got to get you guys to meet. I said, Bob Williams is this guy's name. I said, Bob, this man is 94 years old, and he's as spry as you, and I can't believe what great shape he's in. And Bob says, Oh, he's just a spring chicken. Bob's only 95, but he considers himself a lot senior. So with that, I will get out of the way so that Ambassador Britton can share with us his story. Please welcome Ambassador Britton.
Thank you, Milton. And folks, I want you to know how happy I am to be here, and I want to thank you for your service. And beyond that, and I'll tell you about it a little later. I've had two introductions which were very short in my time, but they are among the tops. One was a man coming down the line of ambassadors with a lady. And his introduction to me was, Your Majesty, His Excellency, Mr. Britton. Her Majesty was the Queen. And we talked for about 5 minutes after that. The other one was I was standing at the end of the foot of the gangplank of the USS Greeling, a nuclear-powered ship. And a little man was standing at the top of the thing. I think he was the boatswain mate or something. And he said, Now coming aboard the United States of America. And with that, I came up the gangplank with my wife. I mean, if that doesn't top them all. The last one was 8 words, but I always remember those days. I always remember that introduction. And I'm always proud of it, proud to be an American, and proud of all that we've accomplished over the years. Milton mentioned that I'm 94 years old. The last year has been one of the most amazing ones in my life. At 93, number one, I found that I had a daughter who I had never known, and she was living in Italy. I did one of these DNA tests, and it came back saying that the person in Italy who has the same DNA as yourself. And I'm trying to figure out, I've been around, yeah, but not Italy, because I've been to Italy a lot of times. But anyway, it turns out that, yeah, somewhere in my lifetime, this lady is now 61, and it's been in the news, the Atlanta paper, plus it's been on TV here and in New York as well. We met in Poland because I had a meeting going on up there at 93. And then in last March, 6 members of my family joined me as I went to Albania to receive the Mother Teresa medallion. Mother Teresa is Albanian, for those who don't know. Secondly, for those who don't know, Albania is the only country in Europe that had more Jewish people at the end of World War II than at the beginning of World War II. It's listed as one of the savior nations at the Holocaust Museum in Israel. And I am their consul general. I'm very proud of it, and I'm very close to the people over there in Albania, and I'm very happy. Okay, Milton mentioned the Congressional Gold Medal. The Congressional Gold Medal is the first award given by the U.S. government. The first recipient was George Washington, and he received it for being the first officer to free a city from the British. That city was Boston. You better jot it down. You'll be asked one of these days. And anyway, but mine says, for outstanding perseverance and courage that inspired social change in the Marine Corps. Although I've been in 2 wars, World War II and Korea, I never had to shoot anyone, cut anyone, stab anyone, hurt anyone. And so, although I have many friends among the Japanese, German, and many others, I've never had to feel that I've harmed someone's husband, brother, father, grandfather, you name it. But anyway, I'm proud to wear it because it shows that I've done something for the Marine Corps. In 1948, I re-enlisted in the Marine Corps because I knew I'd be going back into government one day. And so I was on what we call the inactive reserve. Black men were not allowed to go into the active reserve. In fact, during World War II, we were in supply companies and ammunition companies. We supplied ammunition to men who couldn't even shoot straight, whereas our guys, many of them had fired expert on the rifle range. And we were simply bringing supplies in for people who were on the front lines. Anyway, the Marine Corps, after many of our complaints, had decided to call a group of us together. They wanted to set up what's called an amphibian trucking company. It was to be all segregated, I shouldn't say segregated, it was going to be all black, enlisted. The officers would be white. And so, among others, I raised the roof, said, no, we want to be able to get into the rifle companies, the tank companies, the signal companies, and all the others. And they said, no, this is what we're going to get for you. So I got in touch with my congressman, who I was a scoutmaster at the church, from there into the Secretary of Defense. And back came a letter from the Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps. Henceforth, all organizations will be open without regard to race, creed, or color. 1948. They were a little bit slow, so that when I was recalled in September 2nd, 1950, the Marine Corps was totally unprepared for war. We were still being issued summer stuff as we had in the Pacific during World War II, and yet we were going up to Korea. I don't know if any of you have seen the monument to the Korean War up in Washington. If you see it, you see something like 5 men walking along. They're wearing ponchos. It looks as if they're in a snow-covered area. And I talked to many of the men who served up there who took off their boots at night and their toes remained in their boots, or they lost their legs because it was the frozen things. It's one of the wars that we don't talk about very much, and we don't even know very much about it. And that brings up another story that, unfortunately, sometimes our government doesn't let us know exactly what's going on. We're loyal, we fight, and we go and do what we're told, but sometimes if they asked us, we could tell them, that's not the way to do it. Okay, I want to say that I've covered something like 174 countries, 49 of the 50 states. I've met some wonderful people. When I came out of South Carolina at the age of 10 and went to New York, my family moved into Harlem, the black section, and although 10 years old, I was already in the 7th grade. They put me back to the 4th grade on the basis that children from the South were not as smart as those from up north. And a lucky thing happened. My father lost his job, and we had to move downtown in the white section, and back up I went. I was always given very good treatment. In fact, in high school, my parents had only gone to 3rd grade down here. But a man who had a doctorate from Columbia University, who became my official teacher, 3 degrees from Princeton, took me over under his arm the very first day and said, "Britton, I want you to be a gentleman and a scholar." He never asked me what I wanted to be, but he told me what he wanted me to be. And so he spent 3.5 years. I have never forgotten it. When I received a doctorate from one of the universities overseas, I thought of him. And when people have said, "You're a gentleman," when Queen Elizabeth said, "You're such a wonderful gentleman, it's been a pleasure talking with you," I felt that this man, Mr. Stevens, I wish there was some way I could have talked with him and say, "You did it. You did it." Anyway, I get on to this. I want to tell you a little bit about what the Montfort Point Marine was all about, and some of the other things, and to thank you for what you've done, and I'll tell you why. And then I want to get into a little bit of a couple of books, and finally to tell you some of my views from the Vietnam War, which you may not be aware of. I have a letter here from a gentleman whom you've heard many times, but you've never heard any of his writing. Anyway, someone asked me earlier about some of the early experiences that I had related in other times. I have a friend up in Chicago. His name is Ed Pfizer. Ed Pfizer was in the 9th platoon. Now, there was something like 700 platoons coming through Montfort Point altogether. I was in platoon number 335. Ed had finished his time, his boot camp time, and he was on his way back to Louisiana to see his family. He was sitting in the, this is up in Jacksonville, North Carolina, by the way. Ed had sat there, and 3 buses had come, and he was still sitting there. He wasn't getting on. So this tall Marine came in, white Marine came in, who had been a veteran of Guadalcanal, and he said, well, why aren't you getting on the bus? And he said, well, the practice is whites get on first and then blacks. And in each case it's been filled, so I'm just left here. So he said, are you ready to go? And he said, yes, I am. He said, all right. He called, the white Marine called the station manager over, and he said, you see that man over there, that Marine over there? And he said, yes. He said, when the next bus goes out of here, I want to see his so-and-so on one of those seats, or your so-and-so is going to be on the floor, you understand? And when the next bus pulled out, Ed Pfizer was sitting on that bus. What I'm saying is, we were coming together as a group of Marines. The Commandant had said, given a choice of 5,000 whites or 250,000 blacks, he called them colored in those days, I'll take the 5,000 whites any time. This was the mindset of the Marine Corps. We ultimately ended up with something like 20,000 in the Marine Corps, and I think we lost about, maybe it's between 15 and 20 altogether in World War II. That sounds strange. The population at that time, we must have had, gosh, maybe 10 million or so black folks in the country, but they held us down to 20. Okay. Another man, his name is Mack, Gunnery Sergeant Mack. He came down, his family came down to visit him one day, and he was walking through North Carolina, through this Jacksonville, and suddenly the policeman stopped him and asked him, boy, what are you doing with that woman? The woman was white. And he said, she's coming to visit me. He said, visit you? He said, yes, she's my mother. And the policeman walked away from him just like that. What I'm saying is, the country has been changing, and from the day we started in the Marine Corps, integrating it after the Revolutionary years, and something like 12 of us served, 12 colored served in the Revolution. And from 1898, when the Union was 1798, we were excluded from the military as such. Okay, let's go forward. Years later, I'm reading a book. It's called Army Life in a Black Regiment. And I read about my great-great-grandfather who escaped from slavery and he was in South Carolina, went to South Carolina and volunteered for the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. He was a very profound man. His colonel thought the world of him. He even recommended him for a commission, and the general turned it down. Just as 100 years later, I'm in the Marine Corps, and my commanding officer recommended me for a commission, and I passed all the tests until it got to the oral interview, in which this particular lieutenant remembered my opposing the Marine Corps, and when he mentioned it, everybody walked out. And I missed the commission, but I also missed going to Korea, because that was a brutal war, and I might not be here today had I been in it, because I would have been right up front. And I get to one of my other friends who I just talked with the other day, who graduated from OCS in the Marine Corps. There were 35 in the class, 35 new second lieutenants. By the time he finished up in Vietnam, there were only 2 out of that 35 left. Okay, but let me get on. When I found that I was not eligible for a commission, my enlistment had expired, and I knew that I could get right out of it and get right on up to get right back to college. In the Marine Corps down there, I found also that right after I got there, that if colored guests came down, they were sent to stay, the wives were sent to stay in the staff NCO quarters, but whites were sent to the hostess house. So I asked for an audience with the commanding general. The commanding general was born in Richmond. His father served in the Confederate Army and what have you, but he received me, and when I told him what was happening, he said, well, it'll stop as of today. He said, from now on, it's going to be first come, first serve. And that's the way it's been ever since. So, in a sense, I like to think that I've been changing the Marine Corps through the social process as opposed to the military or the gun process and so forth. And that's why when I see you folks here, especially those who have served in Vietnam, you are the first group of military people who really serve by side as all Americans rather than white Americans or black Americans or Japanese Americans. And I'm so proud of you, and that's why I'm so grateful to be here to be able to talk with you and to thank you personally. When I was born, there was not one black person in the U.S. Congress, not in the House, not in the Senate, not in the government on any level. And today all of that's changed. As a matter of fact, when I was born, it would have been against the law for us to be sitting here. Milton would not have been allowed to sit there. Many of you would have been subject to arrest for being here. That's because the country has changed so much. It talks about to be a more perfect union. We will never be perfect, but we can always strive to be more perfect. And that's the way we have been going over the long years. And I've seen so many changes in this country. I'm so proud of all of you. As I say, I've seen a lot of people in this world, and I've talked with a lot of people. I speak a number of different languages and so forth, so I'm able to communicate with them. In fact, just the other day, someplace I was in, and the waitress came over, and I spoke to her in Chinese, and some people looked over just to say, he speaks Chinese. Well, so what? You got to speak something. But anyway, it's just that I relate to people immediately, and I think it comes back from Mr. Stevens, who taught me, and hopefully I still reflect it, to be a gentleman and a scholar. I read an awful lot. I try to keep up with things, and I'd say to you folks, for those of you who've served over, you have a voice. Sometimes things are done that affect you and you don't even know about it, but you feel something about it. We've been reading a lot about the gentleman who was shot down in Iraq. We were in charge of Iraq, so surely this man must have known that if he came to Iraq, that he was putting himself in danger. But he came, and he was killed along with others. What happens now if we find years later that he was coming on a peace mission because he had been invited to come over there to discuss peace, and once he came out, he was killed? I've served at the very highest of levels of government, and I have seen what happens. Sometimes we don't get the full story. In reading about my great-grandfather who served in the South Carolina Volunteers, many times they wanted to do things and couldn't because the people in Washington who made the decisions had to make a decision that said you can't do this or you can't do that and what have you. The reason why we were not allowed to be on the forefront to fight in World War II has a lot to do with some of the mentality of the people in charge of the military at that time, that it would have been somewhat dangerous for the rest of the country if black men could be seen firing weapons or killing people. And this is part of the mindset that dominated so much of that that we have experienced. It's changing now. And by the same token, again, I get back to it over and over and over again. For the first time, those of you who fought in the war could find others unlike you, but at the same time fighting with you and for you. I remember reading something in the Montfort Point book. It's called The Marines of Montfort Point. It's a group of interviews with many of the Montfort Point Marines, just as the book that you just talked a while ago about those of you who served in Vietnam. And they talk about having to come out in boats and retrieve bodies of their white comrades floating around in the water because they were kept on the boat to bring in supplies when all the troops had gone up front. But yet, so many of them were being killed in the process that they had to come out. And as a matter of fact, one talks about the fact that one day 2 of the white Marines came to him and said, "You're our black angels." Well, folks, in bygone days, if you called a colored person black, you went for a fight. It's common now. But this fellow said that when this fellow came out and told him that he was a black angel, he said, "Why?" He said, "Because you guys have been coming up there to the front and picking up our wounded and bringing them back to medical attention. And many times you come back, come up to get the bodies and bring them back so they could be taken care of." He said, "And so you're like angels to us." And this fellow said that he was happy to hear that he was described as an angel, but at the same time he was still a little bit uneasy about being called black until James Brown came out with his big song, "I'm Black and I'm Proud." And from that point on, he was straight. But I go back to it that in so many instances, our guys who had been trained as Marines were kept on the back on the beaches waiting for the fighting to subside so that they could go up front and bring in supplies and so forth. Until one day, one group of Marines were having a tough time on the front, and a colonel saw about 200 of the guys sitting on the beach waiting, and he wanted to know why were they there instead of up on the front. And they said, "Well, we're waiting for supplies." And he said, "Supplies, hell, we need you up on the front. Are any of you willing to go on front?" He didn't have to wait for the volunteers. They grabbed their rifles and went up there. And they did so well that the Navy gave them a number 4 commendation, which is the highest. And from that point on, the Marine Corps said they're Marines, period. But like the Marine Corps, like any other branch of the service, they always say 10% never get the word. Sometime I think it's closer to 90%. But still there were guys who were held off and just thought that black Marines could not fight. As I told one of the guys, the Marine Corps didn't realize it. None of them had come through one of the tough ghetto sections on a Saturday night or something. But they would find out. Okay, let me get on now. I don't want to dread it too long, but I did want to tell you some of these things that's going on. This is a book called The Marines of Montfort Point. I didn't write it, and I'm not one of the interviewees, but I would say that if you want to find sometimes about the feelings of some of the Montfort Point Marines, those who were in this segregated camp in North Carolina, get yourself a copy of this book. And you'll find some strange things. For some of the guys, one of the guys was interviewed. He was up in Iwo Jima, and he was driving a Jeep, and he came over the hill. And as he came over, he noticed this corporal stopped him, white corporal stopped him, and told him to hold up. And it seemed that there was a group of Japanese coming out of a hole in the side of the mountains. They were emaciated because they hadn't eaten anything at all. And they had taken off all of their clothes except for little briefs. And they were coming out, surrendering with their hands up, 11 of them. And as they got up, the corporal gave the order, and the machine gunners killed every one of them. It's it's something that we're not proud of. We're not that kind of people. Americans have to fight wars. We have to do what we are told to do, but we're not that kind of people. And yet these are the kind of things that can happen in the course of a war. It's related here. It made some of the guys feel real funny. The other one I had is called the United States Colored Troops. When my great-grandfather was in the South Carolina Volunteers, this is in 1862, Lincoln, our president, God bless him, would not approve of colored being in the Army because he wanted to placate the Confederates. And yet, many of the men who felt that if they continued with the men working as slaves, they would want to supply the Confederates and we would be at a disadvantage. So many of the military officers disobeyed orders and took them in. Sometimes unjustly. It talks in this book about some of the men working in the fields, and soldiers would come in and simply conscript them. But in the process of doing it, it meant that they took them away from their families. These men, colored men who were put into the military, did not even get a chance to say so long to their families and so forth. So it was always wars, as Sherman says, war is hell. It always is. Okay. But these are two books that you might want to look at one of these days if you want to look on what's happening in that case. Okay. I mentioned that there was something like a total of 20,000 of us in the Marine Corps as such. And of course, there was a great deal more by the time you got in Vietnam. You know, in the first 2 years of the Vietnam conflict, 20% of the casualties were black military. It got so that it was such an embarrassment that the president and some of the civil rights leaders sat down for heart-to-heart talk to say, listen, certainly we want to be participating, we want to be a part of everything, but something is happening here. We are not that percentage of the population, and yet something is happening. What happened, of course, is the ones who were in the high school or dropouts or something like that were taking into the military and so forth, and so the casualties were very high, and so it changed so that there was more of a balance. We still lost something like 58,000 people, and still that's too many. But the fact is, we had to do it, and I want to talk about it as such. I have an article here that I want to read, and it says, what if? Those two words are easy to ask, whether about our own lives or world history, but the answers can be haunting. A different choice might have created a better opportunity or prevented a tragedy. Just consider the U.S. response to Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence on September 2nd, 1945. Vietnam had been a French colony before World War II started. After France fell to Germany in 1940, Japan seized control of Vietnam but allowed French officials and troops to administer the country. If you recall, France had fallen. The Vichy government had to submit to the Germans, to the Nazis and so forth. So they were running everything. Seeing an opportunity to liberate Vietnam, Ho made his way to Vietnam from China in early 1941. It was the first time in 3 decades that he had set foot in his homeland. He had spent 30 years in exile, living in the United States, Britain, France, and Russia, among other places. He and his initial few followers operated in primitive conditions in mountainous German jungles along Vietnam's border with China. Local Vietnamese slowly joined his cause. With time, his forces, known as the Viet Minh, effectively wrested control of several of Vietnam's northern and most distant provinces. In March 1945, with the war in the Pacific having turned heavily against Japan, Tokyo seized direct control of Vietnam and evicted its French troops. The Viet Minh used the resulting confusion to seize even more territory. The Viet Minh's success attracted the attention of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. In March 1945, an OSS officer met with Ho in Kunming, China, and the two men quickly struck a deal. The OSS would equip the Viet Minh with radios and some light arms. In return, the Vietnam would give the OSS intelligence, harass Japanese forces, and try to rescue American pilots shot down over Viet Minh-controlled territory. A small number of OSS operatives parachuted into northern Vietnam in mid-July 1945. I was in Hawaii at the time waiting for the invasion of Japan to help train the Viet Minh. This so-called team found Ho deathly ill, shaking like a leaf, and was obviously running a very high fever. They treated him for malaria and dysentery, and he quickly recovered. Looking forward to what would happen after Japan's defeat, he asked his American guests, "Your statesmen make eloquent speeches about self-determination." At that time, President Roosevelt, he had died in April of that year, was still talking about self-determination after the war, that the colonies would be free. And he asked he said, "Self-determination, we are self-determined, why not help us? Am I different from your George Washington?" Ho's question quickly became relevant when Japan surrendered in mid-August. With the Japanese defeated and French forces long gone, the Viet Minh moved into Hanoi unopposed. It marked the first time Ho had set foot in his country's biggest city. The streets were draped with Minh flags. Talk of independence was in the air. Ho did not disappoint. In front of a group of hundreds of thousands, he declared in Vietnam an independent nation. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was in the Vietnam Credo. The immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the people on the earth are equal from birth, and all the people have a right to live, to be happy and free. Ho started by quoting Thomas Jefferson's famous words for a reason. He desperately wanted U.S. support, but it wasn't to be. France came back on the scene, resumed its control of Vietnam until Dien Bien Phu in 1954, if I recall. But this happened also in Indonesia. The Dutch had been overrun by the Nazis. They were not able to control Indonesia. So the Allies asked the Japanese to remain in control until such time as the Dutch got a hold of themselves. Okay. I'd like to end with a letter that was sent to President Truman in 1945, just before it. And the letter is something that's of relevance to all of us. It's from Ho Chi Minh, in which he talked about the French and pleaded with President Truman to help them to become free. Unfortunately, the President Truman had to make a decision, and that decision was to go with the French, to support the French, and ultimately the French lost to put Americans in place, something that we still, today, we're good friends with Vietnam. Many of our veterans have gone over there and they have been received with open arms. I'm told that something like 50 to 60% of the Vietnamese people are under 50, so they don't know anything at all about, no, I shouldn't say not at all, but they don't know or have any of the bitterness of what happened during the Vietnam War. We're welcomed over there. the other day putting on one of my garments. I can't remember whether it was a shirt or what, and it said "Made in Vietnam." This is how we're working along. So at this time, I want to appeal to all of you as an organization. When we do things in Washington, make military decisions, please somehow make your voices heard. I never hear the American Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars or the Vietnam veterans having something to say when we make military decisions. Get in touch with your Defense Department, the President, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, and make your voices heard, because you are the ones who have experienced this. At this point, we started out with 3 top Marine generals in the Corps, in the Army, in the government. Today, they're gone, and I don't know why. We have a defense secretary who may be a wonderful person, but I don't get a sense of comfort that it's in the best of hands, and yet you are the ones who have the experience. Somehow, you've got to make your voices heard, and you can do so. I invite you to do so, and I urge you to do so, because if we don't, then those who know less about what goes on will be making the decisions, and the decision will not always be to our benefit. So again, I'm so proud of you, because I can stand here and talk with you and talk to you, something that I could not have done when I was born. It's because our country has gone, it's grown, and we've made it a better country. It's a more perfect union in every respect. And I'm just so proud of you. And again, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. God bless you.
Next time. Well, I have something I want to give you from our organization. This is a rare hardback copy of the book we were talking about earlier. We're very proud if you would like to have a copy of this. We want to thank you so much for who you are. Oh, okay. All right. What? How high do you want it? Secondly, if there's really not a lot of time, but I'm sure some of you may have questions, and I want you to have the opportunity to ask him some questions.
Thank you. I just want to thank you guys for being patient and listening to me. And I didn't mean to take so long. I thought I was going to do about 20 minutes. Yeah.
No questions? Did you have something?
I wanted to just ask for enlightenment. I was in the Marine Corps for a year and a half, maybe 2 years before I ever even knew of Montfort Point. And I was shocked when I realized and learned of the Montfort Point Marines. I was a kid. I thought Marines had always been there, black, white, whatever. And so I was shocked. What was your experience, or did you end up hearing a lot of that among the Marine Corps?
You know, when I came out of the Marine Corps in 1946, I was working at the VA, and a lot of veterans were in it. And believe me, the guys who had been in the Marine Corps, the white fellas, really rubbed it in my throat that we didn't do anything. And so for those of us who had served in the Marine Corps, we didn't even talk about our experience as such. It was years later that we finally began to get. It took something like 35 years before we got the first general in it. And only because there was a certain general who was slated to be the commandant who said, as long as I'm in the Corps, no black person will ever be a general. In addition, at the end of World War II, there were 640 white ladies who were commissioned officers, but not one black male a commissioned officer. It wasn't until November 10th, 1945, that the first one was made a second lieutenant and promptly put on the inactive reserve, because the regulation, letter of instruction 321, said that in no case will a colored Marine be superior to a white Marine. So this is the kind of thing that we lived through and so eventually we had fellas coming up, but they were not stars. They were not the kind of people who step out. And people like the Tuskegee Airmen, you had stars, you had a person who was in very high level, graduate of these things, but we didn't have it yet. So.
Thank you. All right, God bless you.
Thank you.